Now there are certain onerous things that you do need to do in order to still get that permission, but the point is that the certainty exists there so that people can buy properties or develop their properties knowing that they can do certain things. Maybe they can add stories, or maybe they can develop a rear extension, or maybe they can change the use. Whereas before all of that, they would have had to do a very complicated assessment of planning policies, which really, if you read planning policies, they ask for the world. You might be able to do one thing, but it also asks for this thing, and it asks for the next thing, and it asks for the next thing. And sometimes they don't cross-reference each other. They're quite confusing. So permitted development rights are essentially a way of streamlining the process, making it much more black and white, and allowing people to really get on with the plans they have for their properties without having to have planning authorities interfere and interrupt and slow down the process. And if you want to learn more about the planning process and how you can unlock value out of any property, click the link below to learn more. Today I'm going to be doing a video on part 20 of the General Permitted Development Order, but specifically on Class A, which is the ability to add new dwelling houses or units onto detached blocks of flats. Part 20 does allow you to add new units on different types of buildings. This is going to focus purely on detached blocks of flats. I may well do a video in the future on the rest to help you through that, but on this one it's just detached blocks of flats. So we're going to talk about why this is so important, what you need to do in order to apply, in order to benefit from this class. So the big picture is that permitted development rights have been added by the government more recently because there is a huge housing shortage across the country. The typical way of getting houses through planning was to apply for planning permission. You'd apply to a council, they'd deliberate over it, and they would give you a decision. Now, the planning system is at the point of breaking, and the government has got to the point of stepping in, whereby they are now introducing permitted development rights to allow house builders and homeowners to add new units and extend their properties without the need for going through formal planning permission. The reason why that is so important is because planning permission has been now for years, a very, very drawn out process that takes a very long time. There is no certainty as to when you're going to get a decision, no certainty as to if you're going to get a decision, and no certainty as about the outcome, really, because it's got to the point now where local authorities are so busy that they cannot answer the phone, they cannot answer email. And if you think about any other profession whereby you are investing so heavily in something quite important, an extension to your home or an extension to a block of flats or a commercial change of use, which is based on loans and is based on really important, impactful things, the level of service now through the planning process is at a real point where a lot of people have a lot of problems with it. That is the context of what permitted development rights are now. They add certainty to the planning process. There is a certain time frame in which councils need to make a decision, and it is limited to certain matters that councils can assess the application on, so that it stops this very drawn out process of adding in lots of things. It is also no longer a question of policy. So permitted development rights are that very thing. They are rights that owners have. So that means that in principle you have a right to develop these permitted development rights. When you apply for planning permission, you can apply for anything you want. It's your right to apply. But if you don't comply with all the numbers and numbers of policies that are involved in their local plans or their planning policies, then you may well get refused, and throughout that whole process you have no idea as to the outcome, even if you think you've done all your research. So usually when you use permitted development rights, you have certainty that before you even apply, you know that you're going to get permission and you know why. Now there are certain onerous things that you do need to do in order to still get that permission, but the point is that the certainty exists there so that people can buy properties or develop their properties knowing that they can do certain things. Maybe they can add stories, or maybe they can develop a rear extension, or maybe they can change the use. Whereas before all of that, they would have had to do a very complicated assessment of planning policies, which really, if you read planning policies, they ask for the world. You might be able to do one thing, but it also asks for this thing, and it asks for the next thing, and it asks for the next thing. And sometimes they don't cross-reference each other. They're quite confusing. So permitted development rights are essentially a way of streamlining the process, making it much more black and white, and allowing people to really get on with the plans they have for their properties without having to have planning authorities interfere and interrupt and slow down the process, not only from a frustrating point of view of how slow it is, but also, like I've referenced earlier, it can be very costly if you have to wait all this time. If you've got loans waiting on the decision of a planning application, then that's really problematic. So the next point of the process is you know that you can use permitted development rights, Part 20 Class A, which is detached blocks of flats. So you then need to find a detached block of flats. So once you've found the detached block of flats, you need to go through what's called prior approval to use this. So prior approval is essentially a pared back exercise of a planning application. It's all the things I mentioned, a much more secure way of getting permission for things. It's just called prior approval. Now in that, there are a list of things that you need to meet in order to make sure that your application is acceptable. So the first thing I would do though, before going through the list, because it can look quite onerous and quite scary if you don't know what you're doing, if you have identified a site and you know that you want to go down that route, the first thing would be to do is to look for any application that has been submitted using that class. So every council has a public search engine where they can look for planning applications. Look for applications that have been submitted under Part 20 Class A, like I said, for detached blocks of flats. And in there you'll see what level of information has been submitted, but critically how the application has been assessed. Because if you read the prior approval process, which I'll go through in a minute, it lists out a number of things which can look quite scary, but a lot of those things aren't actually relevant to the site or that authority. So the purpose of looking through the planning history is to find out what areas are critical to applications of this nature, which basically is telling you what level of information you need to submit up front, which again is telling you how costly the application is going to be, because you may need to get consultants on board to do reports for you, but you'll end up spending a lot less than you thought you did if you just read the prior approval process cold. So normally the main things that people look out for, and again it does depend, but the big critical ones are transport. Transport is the transport impact of the development. What's the impact on the local transport network, and can your site accommodate new units from a transport point of view, from parking and everything like that. The other critical one is design. Now this is the one really where councils hang their hat on in terms of how they turn down applications of this nature, because it's so subjective. But there are certain kind of assessments that you can do in order to get a fair understanding as to the design impacts of your scheme. The first one is look for designations around your site. I've done videos on this in the past, but briefly, every council has they call it either a proposals map or a policies map. Type in your council's name and then put proposals map or policies map after it. Normally they have a map that layers every policy on that site. And if you type in your address, you'll find out if you are near a conservation area, if you're near a listed building, if you're near to kind of any sensitive areas. The point is, anything that is going to be affected or could be affected by the character of your proposal. So if you have a 3-story block of flats, but you have a conservation area on the other side of the road, which is characterized by a different type of development, or even if the conservation area wraps around your site and there's a different type of development even next door, then if you're going to impact that conservation area, then that is something to be aware of. That's just one example. The other obvious one is to look along the terrace or look along your site. Is your block of flats, if you were to add additional stories onto your block of flats, would that look in character with your area? So if you have a big block of flats next door that's already bigger, it's highly likely that the design of yours is going to be okay based on the character of next door. The other big one, which is closely linked to design, is amenity of your the neighbours mainly. Because if you're going to add additional story, obviously you're adding height, which obviously has the opportunity to block out more sun and block out more light. Now there may be residential areas nearby that will be affected by that. It could affect their outlook, so they may have an outlook right now that is unimpeded, and if you add an additional story, it's going to affect that outlook. But the most critical one, which is actually can be assessed through a report and through numbers, you can assess it clearly, is a daylight sunlight report. These are critical because this essentially assesses the existing situation of your surrounding area in terms of the rooms, how much light they get, and then once they input your proposal, what is the impact of that proposal? Is it going to impact a certain percentage of their light? And then you'll then get an understanding as to the impact of that story on your neighbours, and the council can then make an assessment as to whether that's acceptable or not. This is not to scare you or confuse you. This is basically to show you that if you want to use this part, there are things you need to do, but it's better you know them now than find out through the planning authority who scare you away from using this route. So the key ones are transport, big one is design. Is it going to impact the local area? Will it fit in with the local area? Will it fit in with the host building if you add an additional story? These are the kind of subjective things that a council can hold their hat on. And then the other one is the impact on the amenity of the surrounding area. The amenity of your neighbouring residents, as I've touched on, but also the amenity of the people in the new block of flats. Are they going to have sufficient light in order to have an acceptable quality of living? Those are the main ones that they're going to be assessing on. There are other ones that are very specific to certain sites, so we won't get into them now. It's kind of beyond the scope of this one video, but those are the main areas that you need to focus on. So Part 20 Class A allows you to add up to 2 stories on detached blocks of flats for the use of dwelling houses. And those 4 areas that I've just touched on will be assessed as to whether or not that right is acceptable on your site. Are the transport impacts okay? Is the design okay? Is the amenity impact on the surrounding neighbours okay? And is the quality of living of the future residents of those new units, are they going to be acceptable as well? Those are the 4 main things. Other than that, we're talking about very site-specific things.